afternoon, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Good evening, everyone, wherever you are joining us today. Welcome to the launch of the VIAC ARBalance ADR Wellbeing Toolbox. And we are delighted to have you all here. The idea for this project arose actually in the context of the International Gender Champion Initiative. And for those of you that are not familiar with it, it is an initiative that is a leadership network that brings together decision makers determined to break down gender barriers and make gender equality a working reality in their spheres of influence. And it was co-founded by a number of the United Nations directors, and it boasts over 330 active champions and 340 alumni champions who are the heads of various different international organizations, permanent missions, civil society organizations like ourselves at VIAC. And I myself am a gender champion, and in the course of this gender championship I have to make 2 personal commitments per year. And with the assistance of Emma Potočnik, who is here on our call, you can see her, she is the VIAC CAN director. We came up with one commitment, which was to organize a training with a psychologist, a psychotherapist, or a professional or a coach to support young arbitrators to grow into their roles as more seasoned arbitrators with an emphasis on emotional intelligence, stress management, personal growth, empowerment. And while we were coming up with the concept or the idea for this, we actually said, this is not just a topic that is for younger arbitrators. This is a topic that addresses everyone in the ADR community. And then we thought maybe we can actually make this not just one small commitment in the sense of the gender championship, but we can make it something a lot bigger that we could offer to the ADR community as a whole. And this is the point in time when it was actually Emma, I think, who approached Amanda Lee at ARBalance, who I'm sure you're all aware does a huge amount of work for well-being in the ADR sphere. And we started talking about what we could do to offer some kind of a toolbox or a toolkit to the arbitration, mediation and ADR community as a whole. And you might wonder what it is, why an arbitration institution would be interested in something like this, in a forum like this. Because as an arbitration institution and for VIAC, our focus is, we have a number of different focuses. One is obviously promoting ADR for VIAC in particular in Central and Eastern Europe. The second one is obviously optimizing our case management and offering the most cost-efficient process for our users. And the third is thought leadership. And on the thought leadership aspect, we always think about that in the ADR context, but actually I think we need to think about it in the context of our users. So our users are not only companies, in-house lawyers, they're also arbitrators, they're counsel, they're tribunal secretaries, they're mediators, they're experts, to name but a few. And day in and day out in our work at VIAC, we see the amazing work that they do for their clients. They really often go above and beyond what is required of them in their roles. And one example, just as a practical example from what we see from an institutional perspective. So if we take arbitration, and one of the main advantages of arbitration being that you have a deadline for your final award, and you don't have that advantage or luxury when you go to a state court. You don't have a specific deadline, and the judge is not under any external pressure, so to speak, to deliver the award on time. Whereas in an institution, we have a strict award monitoring process, which essentially means that we are putting arbitrators under a certain amount of pressure to deliver their awards. Of course, we also, in our rules, we have monetary incentives for arbitrators to deliver their award on time, but actually what we are doing is exerting an element of pressure on them to deliver their award. And there have been a number of instances in the last 2 years where I have considered the role of the arbitrator in the arbitration matter, and considered why the award is not being delivered on time. And it might not be to do with the complexity of the case. It might not be to do with the number of requests for relief. It might actually be something completely different. It could be a personal reason, could be a loss in a family, it could be burnout, it could be anxiety, it could be fertility issues, it could be depression, it could be any of those things. And often when we're, looking at how we address this case, we might have to take a step back and think what actually the other factors might be, right? Because, before we're arbitrators, before we're counsel, before we're experts, we're humans. And I think as an institution, we owe it to our users to start the conversation about well-being, to take away the stigma associated with any of these well-being issues, and to provide our users with a toolbox to take care of themselves. Because after all, the work that we do here at VIAC, it stands and it falls with our users. So the ADR Wellbeing Toolbox will start off as a series of online webinars that are for free. You can join them unanimously if you wish. They will be recorded so that those of you who can't participate can look at them again. And we will have experts like our fantastic expert today, who just happens to be a fellow Irish woman, Antoinette, who will speak about these issues, these various well-being issues from the expert's perspective. So without further ado, I have the pleasure to pass over to you, Kabir, for your thoughts on our well-being toolbox.
Thank you so much. Delighted to be here. Very, very happy for this amazing launch of the ADR Toolkit on Love Your Lawyer Day. I mean, sometimes the universe just makes things happen. Let me just take a moment to congratulate Mandy, Niamh, Emma for this amazing initiative. And I know we all want to hear our keynote. I don't want to take away from Antoinette's, time to share these valuable insights. Let me just take a very few minutes to talk about diversity and the impact of diverse lawyers and mental, physical well-being, because there seems to be a strong correlation, right? You see this image that I think is reflective of a lot of women, a lot of lawyers of color, a lot of gay lawyers, disabled lawyers, sharing this kind of a feeling. So with this background in mind, just to remember that diversity is complicated in the sense that it may have many different elements. We recognize gender, race, age, sexuality, disability, which has entered into at least the ADR space of late as something we need to think about. Socioeconomic factors, still less so. And then things like accent, experience, your linguistic background, those are often things we don't talk about, but they all fall within the realm of diversity. And just to emphasize intersectionality, something that has gained attention in the past few years and in our reality as ADR professionals, right? If you have more than one diverse characteristic, you are often fighting more than one battle, right? If you are a woman, you are facing a gender battle. If you're a woman of color, you're facing a gender and a race battle. If you're a woman of color who's gay, you're now a woman facing the women's issues, the racial issues, the LGBTQ issues. And you can imagine somebody who is a woman who's gay, who is, of color, who is disabled, and may come from a linguistic minority. Now, if you look at the number of barriers faced by such a person, it makes things even more acute. The problem gets heightened. And is there a problem? Well, just looking at statistics. Now, this was 2016. So, we will, 2014, forgive me. So the numbers may have incrementally improved, but only incrementally. an investment arbitration presented as a representative sample. It may not be the most representative sample, but we're told 93% of the arbitrators are men. And I just think no matter what your views be on any issue, that seems like an outrageous statistic. If you look at nationalities, the arbitrators tend to come from 7 countries, all of which tend to be global north, from very specific socioeconomic backgrounds. And again, for a field that is international, this is a problem. Now, why are we talking about this? We will hear our keynote speaker tell us much more, but just to give you the description from the IBA report that had come out in recent years, and they tell us mental well-being is much more acute if you are younger, female, from an ethnic minority background, or are disabled. And they do clarify, this doesn't mean that you are weak. That is not the takeaway. But I think the takeaway is that people who face additional barriers are going to see an impact on their mental well-being. So I do take this moment just to commend our organizers for thinking about this toolkit. This is an area people have ignored. Somehow we put priorities on money, on travel, on doing the best, presenting the case in the best way possible. We never think about the impact on our health, on our well-being. And I think it's time for us to do that. So with that, I am going to stop here and I'm going to pass the mic to Amanda Lee. Mandy, as everybody knows her. Mandy, take it away.
Thank you very much, Kabir. I'm glad that the minions are cheering us all on as well. I think that's a nice little well-being boost. I'm delighted to be joining you all today in my capacity as founder of ARBalance as we launch the ADR Wellbeing Toolbox with our friends at VIAC. As ADR professionals and aspiring professionals, it's vital that we protect our health and well-being so we can properly support our clients and our colleagues. Let me take a few moments to set the scene using an analogy I previously shared with the American Review of International Arbitration when I first announced that I was launching ARBalance. Now, this is a literary reference, so I'm literally going to talk about a book now. In Lewis Carroll's classic tale, Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There, our heroine Alice finds herself racing hand in hand with the Red Queen. Feeling somewhat discombobulated, Alice explains to the Queen that in her country, some degree of progress tends to be made if one runs very fast for a long time. Now, the Queen dismisses Alice's country as a slow sort of country because in the Looking Glass world, it takes everything you have to give to simply remain where you are. To make progress, you have to make at least twice as much effort. Now, as ADR practitioners, we begin our careers with shiny, rose-tinted spectacles firmly in place. Our professional goals, we tell ourselves, can be achieved if we apply ourselves diligently to the task of working very hard for a long time. We'll create opportunities for ourselves, build our networks, we'll learn at the feet of our mentors, and by putting one foot in front of the other, we'll progress and we'll thrive. When we seek to win a scholarship, obtain an LLM, secure an internship, become an associate, conduct advocacy at a hearing for the first time, publish a book, make partner, receive our first appointment as an arbitrator or mediator, win an award, gain recognition from peers or directories, we convince ourselves that ADR country follows the same basic rules as Alice's country. We'll run very fast for a long time, and we will progress. And yet, as the field of ADR continues to evolve and the level of competition for roles and mandates grows ever higher, the rules that apply to ADR country appear to be evolving too. It's no longer enough to simply work hard, be diligent, do a good job for our clients and our colleagues, and go home at the end of the day and, eat something and have a sleep. That's the bare minimum required of us. It now takes all the running we can manage just to stay in the same place. And for many, as Kabir has said, that race will be beset with particular hurdles. From the beginning of our careers, we're now expected to publish, to keep publishing, to speak, to keep speaking, to join bar associations and young practitioner groups, and to take on leadership roles within such organizations. We moonlight as event planners, authors, and public speakers. Frankly, we've become consummate box tickers. We're constantly seeking to burnish our credentials to ensure we shine as brightly as our colleagues. And frankly, most of us wear so many hats, we've become professional hat stands. We've traveled through the looking glass and we cannot stop running, even for a moment. After all, if we do, we'll be left behind. So the weight of those looking glass expectations is immense, and the ongoing impact of such expectations on the well-being of those who've chosen to pursue a career in this field cannot and should not be underestimated. Although well-being increasingly features on ADR conference schedules, and this development is obviously to be encouraged and commended, many sessions are not recorded, so they can't be easily accessed by practitioners who are keen or indeed desperate to learn more about well-being challenges in the profession and how to manage and overcome them. Struggling with well-being issues, whether personal or within your family, friendship group, or team, can be an enormously lonely pursuit. And one of the greatest challenges is knowing where to find appropriate help when you need it, and how to find compassionate and understanding allies who've been through similar struggles and are willing to share strategies developed on the well-being battlefield. To that end, ARBalance is delighted to be working with our friends at VIAC to launch the ADR Wellbeing Toolbox today. This new initiative will provide programming and resources for ADR practitioners and aspiring practitioners who are struggling with or simply keen to safeguard their well-being. Exploring sensitive topics such as anxiety, bullying, burnout, depression, imposter syndrome, menopause, and more through an ADR lens. The ADR Wellbeing Toolbox will offer a safe space to explore a catalogue of well-being issues and produce a library of on-demand resources for those who need help but are concerned about the stigma of seeking it. We're delighted to welcome our special guest, Antoinette Moriarty, and all of you today to take the first step on this journey towards well-being with us. After all, if the rules of ADR country mean that we have to run twice as fast in order to make that progress, it's surely better not to run that race alone. So on that note, I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, Antoinette Moriarty. Antoinette is a psychotherapist and organizational consultant with 20 years of experience working with the legal profession. She's currently head of the Law Society of Ireland's newly expanded psychological services and is an appointed member of the International Bar Association's Professional Wellbeing Commission. Antoinette is committed to supporting individuals, teams, and legal workplaces and helping them to perform to their highest potential. We are absolutely delighted to have her here with us today. And so, without further ado, Antoinette, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you to Niamh and to Kabir also, and Emma, I know you're there, and we've been having some very interesting conversations about the work that you're all doing, and I'm delighted to be able to share some of that with you. So as Niamh has told you, I am currently working with the Law Society of Ireland, and we have quite a far-reaching psychological service. Some of my colleagues I know are joining this call today, so I'd like to say hello to them. So hello to Mary Duffy and hello to Julie Breen, who are our psychological services executive team. And we are working with lawyers at all stages of practice, including those like yourselves on this call who are in the arbitration mediation spaces, as well as litigators and family lawyers, trainee solicitors, people who are progressing maybe from associateship up into partnership, and those at the very end of their careers. So we have a big, wide-ranging service, and it's new, and we had a lot of thinking time about what are the biggest issues, you know, because even just listening to what Amanda was listing there and what Kabir was highlighting from the International Bar Association's perspective, it is such a big and complex field when you begin to focus on the mental health of lawyers. So we have taken 3 specific areas that we feel are very interconnected and that do, when worked at together and looked at in the round, do create a different way of practicing, a more supported internal experience of oneself. And these are to address the psychological wellness of lawyers at all stages of practice, from training right through to the end, to influence legal workplaces to generate a space of genuine dignity and respect, because that is the bedrock for all practice, and then to work with the individuals to try and generate a sense of your own capacity, a sense of your own skill by building high impact professionals from the inside out. And because I suppose a lot of the narrative over the recent period of time in particular has been on the difficulties, the challenges, and perhaps the real treachery of long hours of practice in an environment that is not perhaps optimally resourced, we're deliberately using positive language, and the language, I think, of potential when we think about lawyers, because it's a very complex role, whether you're in arbitration as the whole of your working professional identity or whether it's part of it. It's a very skillful area of practice, but it's not enough to be skillful and to be knowledgeable. You also need this piece around, as I think Kabir mapped out beautifully, the environment around you has to be such that your starting point is taken into account and reflected in the environment that you're working within, but also that you yourself as an individual and what you're bringing is well looked after and well resourced. So we're taking quite I suppose, a complex perspective in our service. And we wanted to tell you a little bit more about that today, because there are people joining us from various different geographical areas and areas of practice. But I think what we will all have in common is that you can think about yourselves maybe a little bit more in your team meeting next week, or in your coffee with your colleague later this afternoon, or over lunch, to try and think of yourselves from three distinct but interconnected lenses. There's you yourself and how you are within yourself, your relationship with yourself, if you wish, and your relationship with other people. Then there's this middle piece, which is the role that you're adopting, your professional role within your organization, and the environment of that role. So what is the arbitration community like to be part of is a question I'd love to be able to hear from you about in the chat. So is there a particular flavor, personality, character, dynamic to that professional environment that you can relate to? And what is the impact of that on you and your well-being? So even dropping some of these thoughts into chat as I speak would be really helpful, I think, just in terms of applying this lens to your own situation. And then the third part of it, which is really probably the most crucial and critical, is what is the scaffolding that supports you as you practice? So what is in place already and what is missing from your psychological, emotional, and your your kind of community of practice that enables you to do the work you're doing without the kind of ideas that, Amanda, I think you spoke about, burnout and some of the impacts, the negative consequences of practice that are now becoming far better known, not least through organizations like the International Bar Association's own global study. And one of the, I suppose, most challenging effects of that study or outcomes of that study was to show us that the average, when you think about you, the individual, the average well-being level of lawyers across the globe, this isn't particular to any geographical region, actually, it applies across the board, is of clinical significance. And what that tells us is that no amount of running, no amount of yoga, no amount of sleep is going to intervene sufficiently. What is really required across the whole of the profession at this moment in time is clinical intervention. And that's really challenging, but it's really useful to know about. And I guess one of the pieces that we have been working on or focusing on in our services, this idea around creating strong and adequate boundaries within a profession that itself is, in the throes of dealing with a mental health crisis. And you yourself adopting something of the community sense of this is a shared experience, it's not an individual experience. I myself am at the challenge here, I'm not the difficulty, I'm not strong enough or brave enough or wise enough or experienced enough or old enough or mature enough or experienced enough or promoted enough to make this work. This is actually something that is common across all jurisdictions and belongs to the industry. So you as an individual on this call, having the permission to give yourself strong, adequate boundaries to be able to say yes to what matters to you, to be able to say no to what doesn't, to be able to look after yourselves, whether it's on our on our immediate couple of moments, even before we started the call, we spoke about the influence of family life during midterm, having children there in the background, maybe having work matters piling up while you take time out to do this. All of that is something that lawyers in particular, I think, really struggle with, this idea of being able to say no. And at the same time, there are generations coming into the profession from whom we can all learn, who are coming in with a very values-driven approach to professional life that will be, in many ways, in competition with what the environment has already, and traditionally what the environment has been built from, which is a culture of saying yes. So let's look at this at a little more detail, this kind of tension that I'm beginning to introduce to you between what the individual might mean and need within an organization and what the culture around you is offering you. So just to take a little bit of psychoeducation into the conversation, there are 3 fundamental needs that we all have from any work that we might be doing at any given time. And these, again, sit on each other. So if any of these is missing, you'll find that the well-being level of the individual within that organization is going to be directly impacted. The first of those is your physical safety. And, it goes without saying that you would have physical safety. And yet at a presentation I was involved with earlier this week in Paris at the International Bar Association, there was a delegate from the Netherlands Bar who was speaking about a recent study that they have conducted, and 1 in 2 of their 19,000 members at the Netherlands Bar has experienced over the course of their career a threat to their physical safety. So it's by no means a given that we're all operating in areas of physical safety, but it's a requirement for feeling well, as is the increasingly spoken about psychological safety. And if you think about your brain sitting inside in your skulls, if you want to just put your hands at the very back of your brain and just rest your hand lightly at the back of your brain, just to kind of remember that very lower part of the back of the brain is still with us. It's what's called the reptilian brain. And an easy way of thinking about it is it's like a lizard. It is very reactive. It isn't, it does not have higher thinking powers. It operates at a very low level of cognition, and yet it can be very powerful. It's particularly easily evoked in the absence of safety, whether that is psychological or physical safety. And if it is evoked, it will override all of the higher order thinking. So if your hand is resting lightly on the back of your brain, that is where inside at that very stem of the brain, even the language around it tells us that it's crude, it's basic, it's primitive, it's primal, and it is very old. It's been with us from the beginning of humankind. And so moving upwards, if you put your head up towards that kind of bumpy part of the back of the brain, you're moving into something that's a little more higher level. You're talking about what we call the subcortex of the brain. And that is the kind of part of the brain that'll get quite activated about reward and motivation. And traditionally in the legal profession, motivation has been financial. And I guess a lot of lawyers at different stages of the profession, not just the more senior lawyers, but indeed many of younger lawyers will tell me and tell our team that there's still quite an overemphasis on the extent to which motivation by money is actually considered to be a sufficient criterion for working hard. And actually, we know that even at that kind of mid-level of the brain, the subcortex of the brain, rewards and motivation cannot just be one-dimensional. They do need to be varied, and they do need to come in lots of shapes and sizes. And in fact, our motivation is like our juice. If we don't have high motivation to do the work, creativity will dip, generosity of spirit towards colleagues will dip, one's enthusiasm for any task will begin to be impacted, and that general feeling of well-being, which we kind of talk about, that feeling alive in the work and feeling alive in your relationships, is going to be very easily eroded. So it's really worth thinking about, even as you're sitting on this call, to what extent do you have a strong sense of motivation on a day-to-day level to do the work that you're doing? And again, it might be something that you feel like sharing into the chat. How is your motivation level for the role that you're conducting presently? Because that is going to be a very key determinant of how well you perform. The third piece, and perhaps the most under-nurtured part, and this again is borne out by studies that are conducted right across the legal profession, is the relational element of the work. And I think this is very understandable in many ways, that this is the kind of poor relation in terms of that pyramid of needs from the workplace. It has often been considered, I guess, that the higher professions like medicine, law, and all of those kind of more cognitively, if you wish, oriented professions, that they don't require a lot of relationality, that they're thinking professions, problem-solving professions, and that really, your strength as a professional is to remain unemotional, if you wish, even somewhat detached, in order to be able to think clearly and offer the best solutions to clients. Of course, particularly in the area that you're in, you'll know that just simply won't get us there. We do need to engage relationally. We do need to hear about the person in front of us. We do need to connect with people. We need to be able to make a warm connection with our clients. We need to be able to sit in their shoes, understand their worlds, maybe get a sense of what's driving them, what their motivation is, if we're going to be able to arbitrate on their behalf. We're also going to need to do it to feel well ourselves. So in organizations or in groups or in teams, and even on calls where the relational levels are low, you will find that the energy level will dip. There won't be the same sense of energy or enthusiasm for what's happening. And that relationality can't be forced. So it's something that is born out of spending time, getting to know people, getting to energize your team members if you're a leader, getting to really understand what makes you tick, but also what makes people around us tick. And it may be quite different things. And there is no way of performing relationality, which is kind of hard, but actually worth bearing in mind. So it has to be real. We will experience it as real. So we need to spend time, I suppose, as professionals, ensuring that it's given some kind of space in your day and in your week and in your leadership. And one of the places, I suppose, to move into what resources us to be able to do that well, one of the obstacles, I suppose, that we're all going to encounter is that we all have a certain level of tolerance for stress, for workload, for demands on our time, for demands on our thinking. And in many ways, these are quite unique. These windows of tolerance can be quite unique. They can almost be like a fingerprint. So what I will have as a window of tolerance and what somebody else on this call will have as a window of tolerance for stress will be very individual. But the piece that's shared, I suppose, the piece that's in common between all of us is that our window of tolerance is impacted and affected by the environment around us. And it's impacted and affected by what's happening in our personal lives, by what's happening in the encounters with our clients, by what's happening in the wider culture, by what's happening perhaps even globally. During the time of the pandemic, we had a very direct and immediate experience of people's window of tolerance shrinking very dramatically in the face of fear, in the face of disconnection physically from each other, in the face of disconnection in terms of being able to kind of make that nice relational contact. So the window of tolerance is something that can expand and become very open and wide and generous, and it can contract. And that can happen, without warning, leading to a lot of confusion, I suppose, for us, and to feelings of depletion. So one of the questions I'd have for you is, in terms of you yourself, would you say that your response to stress and to triggering is to become hyper aroused, in which case you would probably be somebody who experiences a degree of anxiety and a degree of high stress? Or conversely, are you somebody who typically, because we'll have a preference, becomes hypo-aroused, which can tip into something that's a little more lethargic, a little bit less energetic than you like, less enthusiastic than you'd like, perhaps disturbed sleep, your concentration may begin to wane, you might find yourself drifting off, becoming less present in your relationships, even in your conversations with people, drifting and allowing the world to kind of go on around us. Now, while we have a preference, we can also visit hyperarousal and hypoarousal, and different stressors can evoke different responses. So a quick way of kind of checking in with ourselves is this beautiful little river image, which Dr. Daniel Siegel, neuropsychobiologist working out of the States, has come up with, and it's called the river of tolerance. So it's a bit like his window image there on the left. So you'll often hear in coaching, anybody who's done any coaching, you'll hear about the flow state, that state where you're thinking freely, the stress is happening and it's real, but you can still find that place of spaciousness in your mind to be able to consider a client's matter, or in fact, if it's in your personal life, your own challenge from a place of spaciousness and generosity. And that flow state is that nice green window of tolerance. And then the hyper place that I'm talking is when it becomes more chaotic. We start to perhaps lose our thread, lose our keys. You might find yourself driving in the wrong direction. So you were headed in one place, you find yourself in another place. So that is that real kind of chaos of the brain. It's very normal. None of this is out of the norm, by the way. Or conversely, that rigidity of thinking where you simply cannot be asked to do anything that's in any way slightly different to the way you've done it before, because one of the ways that you're managing this excessive level of stress is to become quite compartmentalized, rigid. Everything needs to be predictable. It needs to be delivered in a way that you can manage it. And again, there's a kind of a very understandable defense around that rigidity. What it's offering us, of course, is a sense of safety and predictability, but what it's taking away from is that nice free-flowing thinking so that we can make our best decisions. So the next framework that I thought I'd introduce to you is this one of the parent, adult, child, the PAC model. And it's a very simple model in some ways, and deceptively so maybe, but once you know about it, it's very hard not to know about it. So it's one that's really useful when you're working in groups and in teams, to try and check in with ourselves and check if our ego state, which is subject to fluidity, a bit like the stress levels, ego states are subject to fluidity. And again, some of that will come from ourselves and some of it will come from the environment and the triggering in the environment around us. But the adult ego state that we, I guess in many ways are so dependent on as professionals, which allows us to communicate well, to be able to take other people's perspectives on board without losing our own sense of agency, that can become quite squashed in the middle between two other drivers. One is the parent state, and it has nothing to do with being a parent. It can happen to any of us, whether we're parents or not. And at any stage or age, in fact, and the parental kind of stage is where we jump out of being the adult, which allows other people plenty of space to come to their own decisions, and we start taking decisions for people. We start, imposing a way of working that may be familiar to us, that may not be led by the values of the people we're working with. And it's a kind of it's experienced by others, I suppose, as a form of controlling a situation for the person and even for ourselves when we go into it. That's not really what we're seeking to do. I think very often when we move into that, what we're seeking to do is to try and restore some kind of order to something that's becoming quite unmanageable or stressful. So you might find yourselves, when you are working in that kind of intensive space of trying to reach a conclusion, trying to reach a resolution with people, that if the conditions are not optimal, and let's face it, they rarely are, we might jump into that parental stage now and again, where we start to take control of the narrative. We start to perhaps drive an agenda that may not be fully in our client's interest, or may not even be their desire. It might be ours, and we're under pressure for time, or there's various reasons why that parental piece might come in. And then, of course, we can also have the converse, where we might, in response to somebody else being quite affected by stress, we ourselves will retreat or regress into something that's a little more passive and a little more childlike. And again, what we're really doing there is we're not allowing our own agency to kind of come to the fore. We're not meeting somebody in that adult place. And in fact, we might even evoke or invoke the parent state in the opposite, whether it's the opposite party or whether it's in our own client, or indeed even within our colleagues. We can evoke that kind of parental state purely by, I suppose, not being fully in contact with our own adult. And it's very easy, and easier perhaps than it sounds, to be jumped out of that adult state, and not something to judge ourselves for. But it's very useful to try and catch it. So we're going to move a little bit more into your role and your environment. And I suppose building on that idea of the parent, adult, child, the other model that's useful to think about, and it's particularly useful, I think, in the legal profession, because you find yourselves very often being called upon when there are times of challenge. And it is, you know, in some ways it's quite pleasing to be able to help in somebody's challenging kind of environment, and it can become quite habitual for lawyers to go into that space quite easily and to be able to offer something that's quite powerful in that moment, and we all like to do that. I think the challenge is, however, if we become too connected to rescuing, and I think rescuing is not as helpful as it sounds. And the point is, sorry, I think I've moved us along just a little too quickly there. The point about it is that if we rescue somebody, if we go back to the previous slide, we're taking away their capacity as adults to be able to come to something for themselves. And so we're almost jumping over their process where they arrive at the understanding that actually this is a difficulty that I have some control over for myself. So I would really encourage all lawyers to begin to sit back a little more, to begin to allow their clients to arrive at insight and understanding for themselves by creating some of the correct conditions. So adopting more of a coaching perspective rather than a rescuing perspective. This, of course, will mean that in time that your clients will feel less of a victim, less overwhelmed maybe by their own vulnerability, and begin to connect in with that nice adult kind of spaciousness, that nice green flow that we saw in that earlier slide in Daniel Siegelman's work. And I think that particularly perhaps in the ADR space, there is this notion of the persecutor hovering somewhere in the unconscious of the work that you're doing. So there has been a challenge, something has not gone well, and it can be tempting and almost seductive to begin to give the responsibility of that to a third party or to somebody outside the negotiation who could be thought of as the persecutor or the aggressor. There's different language used. That serves a function up to a point. However, it has its limitations. And what I would say to you is it's more useful to kind of think about this as an ever-changing triangle. So the persecutor, who we can locate as the source of all of the difficulty that we're experiencing, all of the discomfort, all of the stress, all of the challenge, that role is only occupiable really if we are playing one of the other positions on the triangle. And everybody, Karpman says, who's on that triangle will at some point in the dynamic play all three roles. So just to try and take a moment to take that in, it means, of course, that the rescuer will also, over time, if you hang in there long enough, become the victim, or in some other dynamic, whether it's in your personal life or inter-team, which can often happen, particularly for lawyers, you may become pulled into being the persecutor. And of course, you mentioned it there, Kabir, at the beginning of the call, there is a very high level of distress across the profession, as we know from the IBA research. There's also a very high level of bullying, harassment, and sexual harassment. And it is generally happening intercollegially. And one of the ways of thinking about that or making sense of that is that if there's no outlet for this relentless kind of pace of work where the lawyer is over rescuing and moving out of their nice kind of spacious green space and adult space and being pulled into doing more, parentifying the client perhaps at times, then, ultimately that persecutory dynamic will emerge, and it will emerge wherever it can. And it's very unlikely to emerge with our colleagues, with our clients for, I suppose, understandable reasons. So what we see is, and the research bears this out, it will emerge intercollegially. And of course, the impact of that is devastating, both for the perpetrators or the persecutors or the aggressors or whatever language is used. We're trying to avoid that language in our models within the Law Society of Ireland, because we see these as colleagues who are, under pressure and expressing that pressure in a way that's unhealthy for themselves, but also for people around them. But, you'll see how it's really important, isn't it, to think about how do I scaffold myself as an individual, how do I scaffold my team if I'm a leader, and how do I really scaffold the community of practice, which I think is what VIAC is so invested in, so that these very understandable human dynamics do not emerge out of the unconscious and in many ways hijack us with dynamics that we feel out of control and ill-equipped to manage. And this brings us, I suppose, to the final part of my presentation, which is this notion that lawyers are wonderful at containing the complexity of their clients' lives. And, you know, you are a very skilled group of people, very knowledge-based group of people, very, usually very highly motivated group of people who want to do the very best for their clients. And if you are trying to do that habitually without any support of any kind of your own, the reality of it is that you, as the containers of other people's challenge, will find yourselves very depleted and very burned out. So this notion comes from group analysis, which is the one of the frameworks of reference that we use in our service, and the notion of each container needing to be contained, and the three elements that are required for containment of other people's challenges are to have your own psychological safety and physical safety, to have your own sense of being valuable and important within the organization or within the team, so your sense of significance, both to your clients, but also intercollegially, and to have a sense of belonging, so that you really feel like this is a place where I can make a contribution, I can speak openly about my ideas, I can take something somewhere and be allowed to run with it, I can try and create something of my own and be given due credit for that. And I can, as an individual and as somebody who's playing a bigger part, I can really get that affirmation that is so often lacking actually within professional environments. And so, it's a really fundamental way in which we will feel well and feel freed up, feel like we have a contribution to make. If these three different elements are in place, you'll find that you're in that lovely green zone. And if they're not, you'll find that you're operating at a kind of a suboptimal level that over time can lead to those kind of crashes that we're talking about when we look at research around burnout. And another very simple model to leave you with is this idea that really, if you can create a scaffolding, both a psychological and a team scaffolding, that will allow you to begin to think about yourself in a way that's very positive. The idea of you being well enough and you being good enough and you having enough to bring to the table, that I'm okay perspective on ourselves, which is often elusive, but also what it really does, and this is a lovely hidden benefit, is it allows us to see other people in the same way. So that I'm okay, you're okay perspective that's often lacking in the workplace is something that doesn't just happen incidentally or accidentally. It is the function of creating a whole host of conditions that are quite complex in ways, and yet in many ways not all that difficult. So, there's a real difference, isn't there, between something that's complex and something that's difficult. And where we often get stuck, of course, is in imagining that if there are challenges or difficulties or things aren't going well, that it's because we're not okay, or conversely, we can, to relieve ourselves of that feeling, we can imagine that somebody else isn't doing their part, so that I'm fine, but you're not okay. Or we can become very troublingly, I suppose, over time, we can get caught into a kind of a dynamic where nothing is okay, that I'm not okay and you're not okay. And in a way, I suppose it becomes almost like a communication game. And Eric Byrne, an American psychiatrist, wrote a really powerful book on the games people play. And it's not a new book, it's been there for a long time, but I think it still stands up. And his model of working that evolved from that book is called transactional analysis. And really, when you're in a transaction, a communication with somebody, there is always a transaction. And it's to try and check in with yourself. Am I transacting in this communication from a perspective of I'm okay, you're okay? Or am I being pulled into something else? Something like I'm okay, you're not okay. This can often happen, of course, in a kind of a mediation space. And the parties are coming into it perhaps with that perspective on each other. Or is there a perspective of I'm not okay, but you're doing great? So that kind of low self-esteem place that we can get kind of pulled into, or that idea of nobody being okay. What we really want to try and create is this sense of we actually all have a contribution to make here. We'll be coming at it differently. We'll have different ways of expressing that and communicating that. We'll also have different, there'll be different times when you're at your optimum and times when you're not. And that should be, there should be space for that as well. So that kind of generosity of spirit can only be offered to others if we offer it to ourselves. So I guess that's kind of the place that I'm going to leave the formal presentation for now. You know, that place of that simple message of how are you doing as you're on the call even? Do you feel like you're operating from that place of I'm okay? Do you feel like you're able to offer that generosity out to other people, to reflect back on the piece around that parent, adult, child ego state? Is it something that you're able to access with ease? If not, is there some support that you could generate around you for that? And that nice kind of river that we put up, where are you in relation to that? And where is your window of tolerance? Is it wide open and full of space? And if not, can you kind of, I suppose, be compassionate with yourself in relation to that and understand that there may be very complex unconscious dynamics at play that pull us out of that nice green river. So rather than judging it and making it as a personal kind of weakness, seeing it as something that, you know, some good resources like Amanda's toolkit idea that she's putting in place for VIAC, that we can lean into, that will allow us to restore that natural well-being. That's so important to be able to do the great work that you do.
Well, thank you so much, Antoinette, for your fantastic and multifaceted presentation. I think we've got a lot of important takeaways to draw on: establishing strong boundaries, recognizing our fundamental needs in the workplace, navigating those ego state dynamics, being mindful of our changing windows of tolerance, trying to get into that all-important green zone, and so on. At this stage, I want to open the floor to our audience and my fellow hosts to see if there are any questions for you, and I can pick up on some of the comments that have been made in the chat to get us started. One of the issues we've raised in the chat is the role played by motivation and the sense to it, the extent to which external motivation might be sustainable in the long run. Are we really all going to be able to be motivated by salary and so on for all eternity? Particularly mindful that being a lawyer is often something that is very closely associated with our personal identities. Many of us can't really, we're not like Batman. We can't take off the cape and hang it up in the Batcave at the end of the day. We are lawyers. This is what we do. This is who we are. So when it comes to trying to reconcile our sense of motivation and our self-identity, how do you think that influences the way we look at our well-being in our professional lives?
Mm-hmm.
That was probably the longest question I've ever asked, and it broke every single rule for questions I've ever been given by Kabir on Tag Time.
You were summing up beautifully, Amanda. That's where I went actually, other than hearing it as a question, because I think it was a really good summary of the concepts that were introduced in the slides. And I think it picks up on some of those really insightful questions that are coming through in comments in the chat. So I'm not sure there is an answer as much as, I guess, any of us. You know, I'm as much at the mercy of this material, by the way. I always feel like there's a real risk if you provide a presentation like this, that at the end of it, everybody is going to imagine that, you know, you live your life according to this, you live in this beautiful green space all the time, and that's not the case. I'm as much at the mercy of all of these dynamics. They're unconscious, and therefore we can't be in charge, you know. But I think being able to accept that we have an unconscious dimension to ourselves is great progress. And maybe that's the edge that those of us who train in the psychological sciences, for want of a distinguishing kind of group to lawyers, you know, we have that, we're confronted with that very early on, that, you know, we're unconscious beings, we're quite primitive, we have 3 different parts to our brain, we're not always in charge of which bit is answering a client who's being challenging or demanding, or a child or a teenager. In my case, Niamh has 3 kids at home today. I have 3 teenagers at home today and 2 dogs. And I'm not always in my green zone either. But I suppose what I do feel you hit upon that really resonates with my clinical practice with lawyers is the idea of the identity. I think lawyers often are drawn into the law because it provides a very strong identity. And I think what begins to happen over time is that cloak, the value of that cloak begins to wane, and the hard work of developing an identity from the inside out begins to dawn on the professional. And I suppose getting support with that is something that I'm very committed to speaking about. In any webinar that I do, I would say to people, don't try and do that on your own, because it's not possible. It is not possible. You cannot live on identity alone. And actually, the bigger, you know, there's an expression in psychotherapy, the bigger the front, the bigger the back. I don't know if you've ever heard that expression, but I use it kind of with my tongue in cheek with lawyers. The more we present as, you know, invulnerable, usually the more help we're seeking. But it is absolutely okay to have both parts going on at the same time, you know, so we can bring an awful lot from being able to harness that part of ourselves, but we can also miss an awful lot. And the bit I think we miss is the self, you know, the self-knowing. Because if we're very occupied in how we're presenting, we're missing the opportunity to really get to know ourselves. And we're only here for such a brief time that I think, you know, the earlier we can start that self reflective piece, the better. And the more professional support we can get with it, the more likely it is to lead to really valuing yourselves in a different way, in a more nuanced way.
So we need to put down that lawyer cape and cowl.
Yeah.
To continue my tortured Batman metaphor.
No, I think I love that Batman piece, and actually that Batman movie, you know, that piece where Batman and is it Batman and Joker have this in one of those movies? Was it the Lego movie, where they have this kind of moment where they realize that part of what's bringing them together is their mutual hatred, and they realize they don't want to let it down, because then there'll be no basis for their relationship. I think there's a bit of that in law. I think lawyers love to hate the kind of hard bits of it, but also love it too. And I often find myself as lawyers call me the non-lawyer. We had a bit of a laugh about this at the IBA. I was being introduced regularly as the non-lawyer. But as the non-lawyer, I can see that actually there's so many elements of how you practice that are wonderful. So it's not to fall into the trap of hating them, but to recognize the cost of them. And there is a difference, isn't there, between, you know, imagining that the cape is all wrong. It's not actually. It's an amazing thing to be able to advise and to problem solve and to mitigate and mediate and negotiate and arbitrate. It's wonderful. But just to be in touch with the cost of it and how to balance it, I think that's the piece that I would like to leave people with.
Thank you very much. We've got a slightly more practical question in the chat. We're moving away from pop culture now. Everybody, brace yourselves. The question that we're being asked is, if you're mindful that somebody's actions in the workplace might be undermining your well-being, what can you do to put them in their place, shall we say, without sounding rude? How do you diplomatically deal with somebody whose actions are potentially causing distress?
Yeah. I think this is back in a way to one of the findings of the IBA research was that, you know, in that US2 report and Beyond US2, which is the more recent one, and we have an equivalent in Ireland called Dignity Matters available on the Law Society's website, which talks about the high levels of bullying, harassment and sexual harassment in the legal profession. And I think awareness is very low around this. So, you know, the experience that people are having of each other, that's not spoken about openly. And so it's never going to be easy to resolve it while people stay silent. So I think creating safety for people to be able to address this without jeopardizing their own professional careers or safety in the moment is critical, but it's very skillful. And there hasn't traditionally been a lot of training around that within legal firms, because I think there has been a view that if people are good fee earners, then over time they become people managers. And I think that really doesn't exist to the same extent in other professions. You become responsible for people because you're good at being responsible for people. And I think it's too easy in a way to blame those lawyers who've been thrust into those roles without any practical help or training, or without any coaching, or without any checks and balances, and without any open and transparent review of their work, you know, to expect them to be naturally good at it because they're good lawyers and they're good fee earners is part of the problem. It's almost setting somebody up to be a challenging manager. So, you know, I think training and creating safe places for people to be able to discuss what the effect of other people's ways of communicating and behaving, and maybe their ways of asking for work to be completed in timeframes and that kind of stuff. If that's not openly addressed, Amanda, I would say, you know, it won't ever change. So, you know, remaining silent about it is probably the very last thing to do, but it's actually the most common response at the moment. So we've a lot of work to do.
Absolutely, absolutely. Anybody else have any further questions that they would like to ask?
I'm imagining the pullback into the demands of the role are probably already we're outside of our time probably. So I'm mindful of people being on your lunch breaks and doing this very industriously on your lunch breaks. So I always admire people who fit something in on lunch.
Absolutely. Well, we have a little bit of feedback in the chat. The quote, "High impact professionals need strong boundaries," was striking.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is important to recognize that not remaining silent and putting boundaries in place can be pretty daunting.
Yeah.
Particularly if you are in the early stages of your career and there's that expectation of, I suppose, physical or virtual presenteeism. You're expected to work long hours because the other associates are working long hours. You don't want to be the person who appears to be leaving.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. Do you have a question, Emma?
Yeah, just a very short comment on what was just discussed now, because I was dealing with something similar earlier in my career, and how to establish a boundary and how to actually, when you're in a situation, how to stand up for yourself. And what I've learned is that I should never attack the person. I should never address the person as a being, but their behavior. So if I want a situation in relation with one of my coworkers change, it's always the behavior that we are addressing and how that behavior made me feel. Otherwise, it can be very quickly understood as a direct attack, and then it's just involves even more drama. So just to address behavior and to stay as objective and calm while doing that as possible.
Yeah, Emma. And it's so powerful when we can do that, you know. Yeah, and I think there's also the bit that's in there, you know, it's linked, isn't it, to the drama triangle, is that when we are being victimized, you know, the natural response, I think, is to counterattack or to hide. You know, those are very understandable. But there's also the piece about what bit of it can we own of ourselves, because there are times when our own response is colored by, you know, there's something of us in there too, which is not immediately obvious to us maybe at that moment in time because we're activated. But over time, having good reflective spaces can help us to become self-aware about what we might be contributing to that dynamic that we can have some control over. And I say that supportively so that we can kind of, you know, so that we can kind of create something different for ourselves, because yeah, sometimes we have more power in these situations than we realize.
It's always two people contributing to a relationship. It's never just,
isn't it? Yeah, but there's a lot of inequality. I think that's the real added difficulty maybe in certain legal contexts. There's the harsh reality of different economic powers and all of that, gender and all those pieces that Kabir brought in. I was just struck by the richness of all that material at the beginning around, you know, what we're bringing in when we show up, who shows up when we show up. You know, if your identity is such that you're already in the minority, that's a lot then to be bringing into that space.
Absolutely. Well, unless anyone has any further questions, we shall hopefully let everybody get back to their working days. Thank you all so much for joining us on the first step of this journey towards happier, healthier careers in ADR. Please stay tuned for more from the ADR Wellbeing Toolbox. We will be confirming the date of our December session soon, so please join us for some tips and tricks on managing the sometimes stressful festive season in due course. And you can always sign up for updates to ensure that you never miss a program in this series either. Special thanks once again to Antoinette for her insights into the human condition and the importance of prioritizing our well-being. And thank you all so much for joining all of us here today. Thank you all, and stay safe and healthy.
Meet you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.